Good evening. Welcome to this very special event with that pink newspaper some of you might know. I'm not saying this because Rula and Philip are here, but I actually receive this paper here since 1995 every morning in my mailbox. And wherever I go in the world, right now I'm in Florence, it actually arrives in my mailbox at 6 o'clock in the morning. And that's an important element of my life. Now, as it turns out, I thought, and I was not the only one, obviously, that the op-eds in the FT needed some new, vibrant input. I never managed to inform the FT about this, but obviously they anticipated this reaction and created an essay contest with major public policy schools, Bocconi University, Trinity College Dublin, Athens University, Jagiellonian and Sciences Po. And they were kind enough to also think that in Berlin, there would be a few smart students at the Hertie School of Governance that perhaps would be able to write an interesting essay. And so we organized an essay competition with our students. Jean was on the jury, I was on the jury, Bashak Chilla was on the jury, Mark Dawson. We read those essays, and we actually had a very hard time in some discussions before we submitted 3 essays to London for a final review by a very impressive group of people Rula is going to mention in a second. And they selected Julian Lang as the winner of the essay competition. And we said we would organize a panel here to discuss the future of Europe, because that was the title of the project. It's the Future of Europe project, with a fantastic website to which you can go and read not only Julian's essay that was published in the FT on 22nd of November, but also the other winners from all over Europe with excellent input. We were just discussing what was the difference between these student essays and the essays by the regular contributors such as Philip Stevens. I think there's something to them. They're somehow creative, they're somehow different, and that makes them interesting to read. So please go to the website and check that out. We will try, as the Hertie School, to get the other winners also to Berlin, to have a discussion of the other students that contributed essays and have a discussion here. Now, I've said enough. I will now turn to Rula Khalaf, who is deputy editor of the Financial Times. She joined the Financial Times in 1995 as a North Africa correspondent, then Middle East editor. Before, she had written for Forbes magazine. And she actually writes on world affairs, Middle East politics, and business. You are a fresh outside mind to this European discussion, because you're one of those who don't write about Germany, Brexit, the euro area crisis, or these things every day. And so it's great we have you, Rula, and I turn the floor to you. I say good evening on behalf of Helmut Anhey, our president, who can't be here, and I hope we can now have a good discussion about Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Henrik. Can you hear me? Oh, great. Well, thanks. I'm delighted to be here. We started thinking about this project a few months ago, and we often talk about the future of Europe. We think about the future of Europe, but we live also in a bit of a bubble. We tend to write about it from one point of view, and we tend to not pay enough attention to what younger people in Europe want, or what younger people in Europe think. So the idea was that we would turn to students and Europe's young minds who are thinking about their future. And this is about them at the end of the day. And so we decided to pose 4 different questions and to leave it to the professors and the students in the 6 universities to decide what to write about. The first question was, would it be wise to reconsider the 4 founding freedoms in EU treaties? The second was, should the next frontier for Europe be deeper integration or handing back some power to nation states? The third was, is it time to concentrate on the Eurozone rather than the broader EU 27? And the fourth was, to what extent is German leadership of Europe desirable or necessary? The professors, as you heard, made the first selection of the winning essays. And we at the FT also had a panel of judges. Was made up of FT editors and some of our outside contributors, including one you might know, Wolfgang Manschau. I was, in fact, one of the judges, and what impressed me most was not only that these op-eds were creative, but they were also thinking about how European institutions and European politicians should connect with EU citizens. So we picked 6 winning essays from the competitions. The essays were published on the FT, and I would also be delighted if you went on the FT website and you read through them. One of the winners was Julian, and I'm going to ask him in a second to talk to us a little bit about what he wrote. I assume you know everybody else on the panel? Yeah. Philip Stevens is our chief political commentator. So let me turn to you, Julian, first. So your essay was titled, "What the EU must learn from Donald Trump," which is quite a provocative title, but that's not why we picked it. But in addressing the existential crisis, you said that the new right was better than the establishment at exploiting modern marketing techniques. And you recommended that mainstream parties, too, should find the emotional, punchy connection to citizens and to voters. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about it, and why you decided on this argument?
So first off, I want to thank the FT and the Hertie School for organizing this competition. I think it's a great opportunity for myself and other students, and I highly encourage everyone to go check out the other articles, including that of Bas Vervaert and Jan Jacob Kromik, the other students from the Hertie School. Yeah, on my piece, I've always believed that the EU and in general centrist parties have had a PR problem. And part of the reason is that they form the establishment, so when they are in charge, they aren't campaigning, they're focusing on policy issues, which is, of course, wonderful for governance. But once the election comes, parties that have never been in government, far-right parties, for example, like the AfD, which has only just now entered the Bundestag, have had the chance to essentially campaign for their entire existence. The EU does not spend that much time campaigning. If at all, the EU essentially only makes the news when something negative happens, it feels like. It feels like when I say the word euro, almost the first word that pops to most of your minds could be crisis, rather than euro area or euro integration or any of the positives that have come out of the eurozone or the EU in general. So yeah, as you summarized my article, I think that if we want to move forward, the EU needs to learn to market itself better. It needs to be able to counteract the fact that far-right and populist parties and general Eurosceptic parties, which don't spend as much time governing, can spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with the modern media, just campaigning constantly, whereas the EU can't do that.
That was very clear during the Brexit debate in the UK, because there was no positive message by those who were arguing against Brexit, and that was one of the main problems, I think, in the campaign. Philip, maybe you can come in here, and do you agree with Julian? Or is the problem the message itself, that there is no good story to tell?
No, I do agree with Julian, and there are lots of good stories to tell about the EU, and lots of, if you like, consumer stories to tell about the EU. You know, we only have, you know, we can move from country to country without borders, with our phones working, with cheap airlines. All these are European achievements, as it were, but they're unspoken. But I'd like to take one step back and say why. And the reason, I mean, many of you will have noticed my own country has gone sort of mad.
We noticed.
And really mad, embarrassingly mad. But what I would say to you is that this is a contagious disease. And the reason, as Rula said, there were no positive messages in the Brexit campaign, in the Remain campaign, was that our governments, Tory and Labour, have spent the last 40 years blaming Europe when things went wrong, or when they were implementing things that people might not like, and taking the credit for itself when things went well. And Britain saw during this period Europe as very much a sort of transactional enterprise, a zero-sum game. We win, sometimes we lose, sometimes. We don't see it as a mutually advantageous project. I think a lot of other governments in Europe, not to the same extent, have got the same disease, as it were. And I think the reason that Europe doesn't have a message is because European governments are not prepared for Brussels, if you like, to have a positive message. And that reflects, I think, a lack of confidence in national governments. I think there's a generational problem. I think there was a generation, we saw in this country and in France in the 1980s, the sort of Kohl-Mitterrand generation, who looked above the instrumentalist, transactional approach to Europe to see the much greater advantages. And I think now, though, even I've been in Germany for 3 months, and even here, talking to officials and to politicians, I see this very transactional approach. We'll do this if we can get this. We'll do this if we can get this, rather than if we all do this together, we all gain. So I think there is a real point about being smart about how we promote Europe, but I think you have to start not by saying, look, Brussels has got it wrong, not that the institutions have got it wrong, but governments have got to actually promote Europe within their own countries.
To go back again to the Brexit vote in the UK, it was very clear that those who believed in Europe were amongst the younger generation, but their voices were not heard. I mean, all the consumer benefits that Philip is talking about, they feel it, and if you asked young people, they would be saying, you know, but what about roaming? What about travel? What about studying and working in Germany and France? Given what's happened over the past year, Henrik and then Jean, is anything changing? Is the message, you think, getting through?
First, I think we need to put this age argument which you brought into perspective. If you look at France, 50% of younger French voters, 50%, more than 50%, voted either for Marine Le Pen or Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So this is the majority of young French voters. The lowest share of the Le Pen electorate in France was among the above 65. So it's the exact opposite of what's happened in Britain. So in that context, I totally agree with you on Britain, but I think on the rest of the continent, due to difficulties for younger people to join the labor market, to find a place in this rapidly changing society, it's actually also the younger people that reject the European project or want a very different European project. Now, when you ask, has something changed? Yes and no. You know, Europe is often portrayed as a ship. And 8 years ago, this ship got into this storm that almost destroyed it. And then 2 years ago with the refugee crisis again. What happened is that the European Union improvised repair measures to keep the ship afloat. What a normal person would do once the storm is over is seek safe harbor and review the ship and do fundamental repair work so that the ship is stable again. What we do in Europe is say, we stay on the water and we will also weather the next storm. And that's obviously very dangerous. I've come just from the Munich Strategy Forum where people were extremely positive about Europe, optimism. You know, Macron is there and Merkel will have a government, everything will be fine. And they say, and the reason is things are so well, you know, there's growth in Europe, unemployment is declining, we have some ideas about Europe. But this actually works only in the good weather condition. If there is another storm coming up anytime soon, I'm seriously worried about this European project. And the Macron proposals, that's the only set, together perhaps with Juncker, of proposals out there that really take a larger perspective. But honestly, they have been killed by Eastern European countries in Tallinn. They have not yet been taken up by the German government. And so, do they really have a hope to be implemented? I would be very skeptical today. And I don't share the optimism about the Macron-Merkel couple to actually fix this anytime soon.
Well, the narrative has certainly changed in the last few months, and since Macron's election, the fact that there's a European economic recovery. So, Jean, do you fear complacency?
Let me say something first about the essay. I think what I liked very much with this essay that it sort of broke with a taboo that those who are in favor of Europe should not enter this sort of arena where you're playing politics and you're fighting you're fighting a political battle. And when you said Europe should learn from Donald Trump, you said it's not with sort of technocratic proposal. It's not by focusing on policies. It's not so with reasonable things for reasonable people that you're going to win this battle. It's a battle, and you have to enter it. And I think that's very provocative because that's exactly what we have tried to avoid for very many years, and that's exactly the opposite of the standard reaction to the rise of Euroscepticism. So we should retreat. Europe should not be at the forefront of the political battle. It should be left as something for the elite, something for the policy wonks, something that makes progress without being put to public opinion. In difficult times, you just retreat and stop doing things and doing under the radar, and you're saying the opposite. Now, the hard question to you is who should tweet, because you need a player. You need someone who is able to fight this battle. You need someone who has legitimacy. You need someone who has the ability to to play politics, and that's a sort of that's a dangerous game. That can be a dirty game. If we do that, we're going to play with Orban. We're going to play with Kaczynski. We're going to play with people who are not going to be nice to us. And then the question is, what are the implications? Now, in a way, and just to answer your question, it's a bit what Macron did during the campaign, because he essentially put back Europe at the center. I mean, we in my country, since even before the referendum of 2005, even after the Maastricht referendum, so 1992, Europe started being divisive within each party. And so the reaction of each party was sort of to put it aside and to sort of have very sort of content-free proposals, content-free statements about Europe during campaigns, and so to avoid the topic. And what Macron did was to put it center stage in his campaign. Now, that's what a national politician can do, and I would disagree a bit with Henrik when he said in France, as opposed to Britain, the young people were not in favor. It was not, the presidential election was not a vote about Europe. I mean, I think the people who voted for Mélenchon, they did not vote about Europe. Because they voted Mélenchon because they thought that issues like, domestic distribution or the green transition were more important than Europe. But it was not a vote for or against Europe, as opposed to the Brexit vote.
He also had a very creative campaign.
Mélenchon, yeah. He also had a very creative
holograms.
Campaign. Yeah. Hologram, yeah. So should a hologram, you know that he had a hologram. He campaigned at two places at the same time. So one was a real one and one there was a hologram. So should a hologram tweet?
Well, I think we have to go back to Julian because you have to answer.
So I don't know about a hologram tweeting, but I think you might have answered your own question in your own sentence. Macron did it. He was a national politician. He campaigned with the EU at center stage, and he won. I think that's a good sign for other pro-EU parties out here. The CDU did it here to a very, very limited extent. Every now and then you would see a campaign poster that said, strong Europe means a strong Germany, and similar campaign things.
That's what I meant by content-free statements. we had it for in each and every campaign. A strong France in a strong Europe, or
I don't think those are necessarily contradictory.
Can I disagree on Macron? I mean, we can
do a whole round of questioning on Macron.
We should be very precise. Yes, Macron won that election, and we're all happy about this. But he scored 24% in the first round, of which 50% said, we vote for him because there's no other decent choice. So this leaves 12% providing real support to Emmanuel Macron in the first round. In the second, he got 66% almost, because there was no other option. But let's be careful to construct the narrative of a European story winning a country. I think you're right, he tried it. But I'm actually more skeptical now and say, well, it's not that easy with that narrative to win an election campaign. He was lucky. Fillon collapsed, etc. But isn't
that the point? Isn't really the point? And actually, I don't think it's content-free to say more Europe means more France, because we have national elections, we have national polities still. If politicians want to win national elections, they win them by saying, I am going to make, or this party will make this nation stronger, more prosperous, more secure. The link with Europe is the one that says, we do that through Europe. We do that by cooperating with our European neighbors. That's what the European ideal was about, as well as peace after the Second World War. It was about being more prosperous, more secure, preserving our values, more influential in the wider world together. That is still the same ideal. Of course, it's about all the sort of conveniences and the consumer things, but unless you actually believe that your nation is better off in partnership with its neighbors, with neighbors which have the same values, the same approach to the world, then Europe will never work. So until every nation...
It doesn't say anything about what you expect, what you want to do. That's what I mean by content-free. I agree. It's a statement that would be difficult to see from the British Conservative Party. But still, I mean, it has no content in terms of... after being repeated election after election, it doesn't say anything about what you want to achieve, what you expect from Europe, what the value to the citizens.
If we want to have sane liberal immigration policies that show our humanity, but also show respect for our own populations, then we can only do that together. That's not content free.
No, that's not content free at all.
I interrupted you.
Julian, go on.
Yeah, so I actually forgot what my original thought was, but I'd like to respond to you now. I think you might have misunderstood me. I don't think that it's necessarily a pro-EU message that wins the election, but the marketing surrounding the election as a whole, and the fact that pro-EU candidates don't really take as good advantage of that, and generally not just pro-EU, but centrist establishment candidates. If we think about the US election, going away from Europe now, Hillary Clinton outspent the Donald Trump campaign on commercials by an extremely large margin, yet it was Donald Trump who was constantly in the news. The concept of an attention economy, I think, is extremely important, and that we need to, that there's a limited attention span for the average voter, and we need to find a way for our message to get into that gap, because right now we're losing it. And it's not necessarily just being pro-EU as Macron did. I think that's important. I think, like Philip said earlier, being confident is an extremely important part of all this. But at the same time, there's more to it than just that, of course.
So, what you're talking about is one level of response. The other level of response is in terms of policies and whether Europe should move towards greater integration. So I just want to get a reaction from each of you to Macron's Sorbonne speech. It seems to pop up in every single conversation you have, you know, anywhere in Europe these days. With that, you know, people urge a German response, which will probably have to wait until the end of the coalition talks and a new government to get that. Jean, do you wanna start?
Yeah, I think, you know.
Did you have a hand in that speech?
No.
No.
I think what I liked with the speech was that the structure of the speech was especially clear. I mean, the structure was about, you know, there are, as Philip was saying, you know, there are things that belong to Europe and there are things that belong to the nation state, and what he called the public good, the European public good. And let's start from, you know, having a clear view on that. And that can be communicated to the electorate. It's when you look at opinion surveys, and you ask people, you know, what do they find belonging to Europe, and what do they consider belonging to the nation state? They have very clear responses. For example, they will tell you that solidarity, I mean, you know, social security is intrinsically national. They don't want a European social security. But they think that issues like mass migration, issues like development, issues like climate, they belong to Europe. So they have, and I think the challenge for politicians is to translate this, I think, relatively clear and, you know, common view, I mean, among perhaps not all countries, but a sort of set of countries, into a political agenda.
Philip, he had very specific, I mean, pages and pages of very specific proposals as well.
Yeah, I mean, I take a rather different view from Jean about things belonging to the nation state or to Europe, because I think some things have to belong to both. Borders, most people would say, belong to the nation state, but we've learnt that we can't control our borders unless we operate together. So there's an example of a policy that belongs to both. So you promote your national policy through a European, if you like, project. The specific proposals he made, and I'm not going to comment on the Eurozone because it's too technical. I personally believe the Eurozone is going to have to become an economic as well as a monetary union at some point. But if you look at defense and security, it seems blindingly obvious that particularly as Britain sort of removes itself from its own continent, it seems blindingly obvious that if we each nationally want to make our people more secure, we have to operate on the European level in order to do so. So I think there are very concrete, I think we're going to have a European asylum policy. I think we're going to have to have at some point a proper European energy policy, as well as these. But as I say, I think Europe will only work if people in their own minds make this connection between the national interest and the European interest and see them as mutually supportive rather than mutually contradicting.
What I don't see is how you can sell these policies to, I mean, you could sell them in Germany, but how do you sell them to Eastern Europe, for instance? I mean, when you think of how difficult it was for the Chancellor to get any kind of consensus on the refugee issue just, a couple of years ago, she tried very hard and it was nearly impossible.
Well, I think with Eastern Europe, we have to, as Western Europeans, understand that here is a group of countries which have basically rediscovered in the last 25 years their sovereignty. And they're not really prepared, as things stand, to reinvest it, as it were, in another project. So I think one has to be, I was going to say tolerant, but that sounds supercilious. I don't mean that, but I think we have to accept patient. We have to be patient with these countries. We will have to see parts of Europe, as Mr. Macron said, move ahead with some projects. But it doesn't mean that these other countries are excluded from all projects. So a European security project, I would have thought Poland has to play and would want to play a significant part. So I think, you can have this multi-tiered, if you like, multi-speed Europe that isn't just about sort of east-west blocks or north-south blocks. But there are absolutely practical things. But as I'll keep going back to it, people have to see that their national interest is part of the same European interest.
Henrik, what do you think the German response should be? And the SPD, I heard Gabriel yesterday just saying that there's a Macron moment and we risk losing it. So there has to be encouragement and there has to be a response. At the same time, you can feel quite a bit of skepticism.
What's important in Germany right now is that we don't think the Grand Coalition is a vote about the Macron proposals. That would be a very wrong approach. What we need is a counter-proposal to Macron, a very German counter-proposal. In the sense that what comes out of the discussion ultimately is the European interest. So there's a French interest with Macron's proposals. Germany should now make up its own mind, and then together there should be a European moment. And in that sense, I think Germany should follow the example and think as systematically about Europe as Macron did, but not take the speech and say, we agree, we disagree, we agree, we disagree. That's very important. Macron in his speech avoided 3 traps. The first one was the European narrative trap. I think everyone for a while spoke about Europe needs a new narrative. I think that's impossible. It's very difficult. Europe is just there. And so we don't need a narrative for these kinds of things. The second trap was to go into the visionary long-term speech about la finalité of Europe. Joschka Fischer delivered that speech 15 years ago, so we don't need to have another one of those. And the third trap was to try to please everyone, which is something in this city you can sometimes see in European policy making. You actually try to get everyone on board. And I think Macron was right in saying, here is my blueprint. If you Eastern Europeans don't like that, well, that's fine. Let's talk about this. Perhaps he could have been slightly smarter in getting them on board. But we want divisive speeches. We want clear approaches. And what I hope now is that with the SPD, CDU government, if it's coming, we get a German counter-proposal. And
do you think that needs to be in a symbolic form, in a big speech?
I mean, if you watch Macron at the Sorbonne, just spend a minute trying to imagine our Chancellor delivering a similar speech.
I think that's do this.
It's not her way of communicating her ideas.
Well, it may not be her way of communicating, but is that not needed?
Well,
Isn't there some things, gestures don't matter?
again, it's a matter of style. I think François Hollande could not have delivered a Sorbonne speech of the same style, just because it's not his style either. If Germany now, in the coalition negotiation, ended up with a crisp chapter on Europe, and this chapter would be given to everyone across Europe, people would read it and say, hey, look, this is really good, this is sharp, this is precise, that could be a German moment in that context.
And then Julian can sell it, market it somehow.
Oh yeah, we should
I'm just a
again.
master's student and not in marketing, so wrong choice.
But what do you think, Julian?
I think Henrik was completely right here. I hadn't thought about it like that, to be honest, but I agree with you entirely that Germany should come up with its own set of proposals. However, I am extremely pessimistic that will happen with the Grand Coalition. It seems entirely unlikely that they would have the political momentum or legitimacy at this point after the collapse of the Jamaica talks and the SPD and CDU's low turnout in the election for them to have much oomph behind their proposals. I feel like if they bring out proposals now, I think they're going to lose the spotlight to Macron's proposals no matter what.
Let's open this up to questions.
And you're saying the opposite of what you wrote.
In what sense? I
think you're going to have to take.
You said those who believe, those who stand for Europe should fight.
Oh no, of course they should. I'm pessimistic about the chances.
But why?
Because they didn't do a great job during the campaign in the election. I think if they fought now and they actually did it, I'm concerned that there's enough confidence in the party. We talked about confidence earlier.
I mean, I think there is
I'm trying to
no
this.
deep contradiction here. I think the proponents of Europe and deeper integration should actually stand up and fight. I think what you're saying is that in the SPD today and in the CDU, there's simply not enough courage to stand up and fight. And honestly, I tend to agree with you. There is a very hesitant way of positioning themselves. Another point where Macron is just very strong, Jean worked with him, he just renverse la table, as they say in French. So he just goes his way and say, I'm going to do this. I don't care that much about the implications. And the current political leadership in Germany doesn't have this characteristic.
Okay, I see a question there, and I will. Yeah, let's just take. Maybe we'll take two at a time. So there, and then
Hi.
behind you.
So I have two different questions which are a bit overarching.
It'd be just useful for us if you could say who you are.
My name's Sophia. I'm an MPP student here at Hertie, and I'm also a journalist at Deutsche Welle. So my two questions are a bit overarching. I'm going to try and summarize them quickly. As someone who's been working on social media and the combination of social media and news for quite some time now, my question would be, I really liked your essay, but my question would be, how do you see the long-term feasibility of catering to a certain populist speech? Because Macron and Trump have it easy. They don't intend to deliver on any of their promises, not really. They don't have any solid policy proposals, and so it's very easy to tweet. And I spent the last year basically live tweeting Donald Trump, so I can tell you how easy it is for the man to come up with stuff on the go, because it's clearly on the go. How do you do this, which I agree we should do, and make it substantive? Because it's very difficult to use now 280 characters for substantive, long-term policy ideas. On the other side of the panel, my question has more to do with the denial, about the threat of populism, but also the idea of the transactional or two-speed, three-speed, multi-tiered Europe. I come from a southern country, and to me, as I go through, and I've lived in the UK, and now I live and work and study in Germany, I feel like solidarity is dead as a concept in the European Union. It's all transactional, it's all business, it's all we can take away from it, and it's all what Germany and France will do to drive us forward. The Eastern Bloc decides to not go along, maybe a couple of them join up and decide to put up a front, and everyone else is just not included in this idea. There is no opening up of the debate. What kind of Europe do you envision if only Germany and France can lead?
Well, since this was 2 questions, I'm going to let you answer before we go back to the audience.
So I can take the first question at the least. You said it was short. How do we balance the short term with actual policy decisions? I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I just think that right now the EU, for example, with Juncker's white paper, is putting a lot of spotlight on the policy discussions. Those policy discussions still need to be had. By no means should we get rid of those for just tweets. But that doesn't need to be where we're focusing our campaign on. Our campaigns can be focused on a lot more emotional narratives, things like that, and I don't think that's unsustainable. To be honest with modern media, I see this more akin to a fundamental change in how campaigning needs to be done nowadays. If the comparison that comes to my mind is, if any of you have studied U.S. electoral history, it's very famously known that in JFK and Nixon's first debate, which was the first televised debate in U.S. history, pretty much everyone who listened to the debate on the radio thought Nixon won. When those who watched the TV thought JFK had clearly won. There wasn't any policy difference that made JFK win if you watch the TV. He just looked presidential. We need to learn how to adapt to this new media area and find a way to balance both Inhalt in German, content, but that doesn't need to necessarily be what's up front, what's grabbing attention. Because normally, I mean, tax reform doesn't grab a lot of attention, let's be honest. So.
What about banking union?
No.
I'll answer, if you like, your question about solidarity in one speed, because I brought it up. I don't think actually you have to have uniformity in order to have solidarity. I mean, Britain was never, if we'd stayed in the EU, we were never going to join the euro. And that was, I think, a reasonable decision for the others to say, we want to go ahead with this project, and a reasonable decision for one government to say, well, we don't want to be part of it. I would be surprised if Poland wants to join the euro anytime in the next 10 years. But so I think if you have a sort of multi-speed, multi-tiered Europe which excludes nations, that's one thing. But if you have a menu of options for nations to join when they want to, then I think that's entirely consistent with solidarity.
There was okay, there are 3 questions. Who had his hand up first? You, the one in the middle.
I'll give it to you after.
This is Bas Verwaard, who was the runner-up to the essay. Second, silver medal. We should give him a hand of applause.
Thank you. I just want to quickly, because my question was the same about this two-way speed Europe. I lived in Czech Republic, and in politics, I was in. So I have a little bit of a sense of some of the issues there, I think. And one of the things that continuously comes up in every Euro Council, Econ, Fin, whatever council meeting there is, and there are briefings, etc., is like, and Czech Republic is not in the Euro, but is in the European Union. We don't want to be excluded. We want to know what's going on. We want to be on the table, right? When it comes to banking union, Czech Republic is like, well, we don't want to join, but we don't want to be left out of the discussion. So my question is, and I think this is a sense that it's not only in Czech Republic, but it's the same in Poland and in Hungary and Slovakia. So if you're going to go for that two-way Europe, is it not exactly going to give you more drawbacks? Aren't there going to be like, well, now you're excluding us from the table because, well, you're only discussing with the Eurozone 19 countries or the banking union 15 countries. Would it not give more drawbacks and create more division in Europe?
Okay. Philip,
Well,
do you want to
very
come back?
briefly,
And maybe
very
Jean
briefly,
can also.
What you're proposing is a recipe for starters, because we're never going to get all 26 countries wanting to do the same things at the same pace. So I agree with you that you have to include people, and I think you have to get political consent for big projects from everyone. But you're not, and your argument, we wouldn't have a euro because the UK would have said, we don't want to be part of it, and therefore you are not allowed to go ahead because you're excluding us. There are a lot of other things that we wouldn't have had, countries each been allowed a veto. So I think you have to, you're right. What you can't have is like, we're going to exclude a whole class of countries, whether they're Eastern Europe or Southern European, from these projects. But you can't equally have one country, particularly my own, when it was there, being, saying, well, actually, because we don't want to do it, no one else can do it.
Jean?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. I mean, look at what happened during the euro crisis. I mean, it was in principle something that should not have happened, that we were able to take so many new decisions with the consent of those not participating in the euro. I mean, the problems were never in the first place with those not participating in the euro. They were with those participating in the euro. And so Britain, for all the, what we can say about its attitude, very much decided that it was in Britain's best interest that the euro would survive, and then accepted that we move ahead on a number of fronts. Now, if we want to go this way, this requires a very clear discipline on the part of those who want to take part in those projects or promote those projects, that they don't use them as sort of vehicle to exclude. And there is always a temptation to say, and there is always, let me speak as a Frenchman, there is always a temptation in my country, because there are people who think that the world was simpler in the past when the new member states were not there. And I think we should not concede to these people. I mean, every project, every partnership should be open, and those who want to go ahead should not use it as a way to exclude, and those who do not want to take part should not use it as a way to block.
Henrik, you want to come in here?
The answer is also smart political tactics and good leadership to keep countries in groups on board. I think it would be a mistake to only deepen economic and monetary union today, because you leave Eastern Europe alone. If at the same time, so you do deepen monetary union, but you build a security alliance, common foreign and security policy, you suddenly create a project that talks to very different groups of member states. The foreign security project is very attractive for Sweden, Denmark, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. They're all not part of the euro. So if you build that, they would be very happy. They would feel on board. If you do that alone and you don't do the rest, Portugal doesn't really care about foreign and security policy in the same way, but they care a lot about the euro. So you need to combine through packages this multi-speed or multi-tiered Europe. I think it was a mistake, and I made this in the past, many others made it, to simply think about two-speed Europe and deepening economic and monetary union. We need to do multi-tiered and at the same time to keep everyone on board.
There's a lady towards the back, yeah.
Inge Kaul, Hertie. My question goes to Henrik. Judging from the enthusiasm with which you presented the proposal to have a counter speech, I was thinking maybe the speech is getting ready in your head. So could you make this evening a very special evening and give us a sneak preview of how it, at least the opening?
This is a, thank you, this is a wonderful opportunity. I think, Henrik, you're going to take it up.
So when you get the Nikolaus bag, it's 6th of December. In Germany,
Yes,
that
yes.
tonight Nikolaus, or last night Nikolaus came and dropped chocolates. You get a set of various issues. You get fruit and chocolate, etc. So I cannot detail all the elements, but I think we can be very simple. What I would put in a counter-proposal from Germany is, first, the general commitment, Germany in this government in the next 4 years will support a reform of the European Union and will constructively work on such proposals. First, in the area of security, propose measures before the new Commission comes into power to work on a foreign policy that is effective, on border control, Frontex, a joint asylum policy, a joint migration policy, and then also a security policy in the area of police cooperation, fighting terrorism, and this European Attorney General being able to get into policing. That security chapter is the first element. The second chapter, I think, is about the competitiveness of Europe and its growth position in the world. There we talk about the digital single market, we talk about an effective EU budget that creates public goods, that's about education and elements of that kind. And then the third element is economic and monetary union, where you can go into making proposals at the same time on risk reduction, risk sharing, a European monetary fund, completing banking union, and things of that kind. And you would end by saying that Europe needs to have a smaller commission, a more effective commission, but stick to the community method. You would say that countries that don't cooperate with democratic or don't align with democratic principles should be punished through financial sanctions, and you ultimately support the idea of electing a few EP people on a transnational, trans-European list and not only through the national parliaments. So I think a package like this could be agreeable to the SPD, could be agreeable to the CDU, and could pave the way for a discussion with Macron.
Yes, please, Jean, go ahead.
I'd like to add something, not on the substance of the proposal, but then the attitude. We had in one of the essays published by the FT and one of the essays also written by Hertie Student who didn't make it to the end, pieces on German leadership. Yeah. And I think that's very important. We don't want Germany that behaves as a normal country. Germany is not a normal country in Europe. Germany has responsibility, being, the largest, the most powerful, the most economically successful country. And I think a major question is how Germany behaves with this role, which is a fact. Now, it's easier to say from a French point of view now that we have a president that, as a politician and with a legitimacy given by the presidential election, has also leadership. But clearly, in terms of, economic strength, that's the balance is not there. So we're expecting a Germany that lives up to this role that comes with economic power.
But it's a role that Germany also assumes reluctantly.
Very reluctantly. That's precisely my point. That Germany should assume it less reluctantly. Yeah. And I think that was also what the point that was made in the two essays written by students.
Absolutely. I think there was a question here. Yeah, go ahead.
So, thank you. If I would like to be provocative, I think then the German plan will not be so different from the speech of the Sorbonne. And I think before the speech of the Sorbonne, there was the speech in Athens. And I think this speech is more important because the speech of Sorbonne, and as you mentioned, the list of very good, reasonable proposals that you just made are very accurate, very useful, very good. But I think we miss a point, which is what Macron said in Athens. In Athens, he said, in Athens, meaning with the heritage of the 2,000 years of democracy, he said it's time to stop the civil wars. And he was courageous enough to have this sentence. And he said, in fact, we invented here democracy. We invented here a governance for a state, and we miss today the point in Europe. Instead of looking for tweets or narrative, you don't think it's time to go back to this very simple idea, but which is very courageous idea, which is democracy. And then you have the the link with the citizen. And then you have the mobilization of the citizen, because you will have not only a plan, but transparency on the execution of the plan. You will have democratic control of the execution of the plan. You will be sanctioned if the plan is not done. For me, the caricature of the Europe which failed was the Lisbon strategy. If you remember this Lisbon strategy, I think it was in the year 2000, if I well remember, and the plan was, and was a clever plan, was to make of Europe the most modern, innovative economy in the world. This was 17 years ago. What happened? Nothing. Naming and shaming, always clever points, but no result. So once again, instead of tweets, and instead of lists which were already there, because the Sorbonne speech is a summary of already existing proposal, isn't time to have this very true link between Europe and citizenship.
Yeah. Julian?
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with a similar answer to the one I gave earlier. I don't think having a modern marketing strategy that employs social media is separate from making policy choices. Of course, if you only do the one, then yeah, you're going to end up with entirely incompetent governments because you can't do reforms. I am fully in favor of increasing the levels of EU citizens' paths to engagement with the EU through more power to the European Parliament, among other measures. But again, I don't see that as being in any contradiction to what I spoke about in my article.
I think there was another question over there. Yeah. I think that the lady there. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if the going back to the idea of marketing strategies per se, do you think that one of the challenges that the EU has is that with Brexit and Trump, they were tapping into cultural narratives and their focus, but by virtue of being isolationist or being on a nationalist focus, they can already tap into existing cultural narratives. But what is the European equivalent of that sort of marketing strategy when you can't feed in, for instance, patriotism or isolationism into like a European narrative that doesn't work on a supernatural national level?
So what are the slogans of a pro-European campaign?
First off, thank you for this question because it actually brings me back to the point I never finished making earlier, thanks to Henrik. I think, as I was saying earlier, I think Macron's campaign is a good example of how you can integrate these kinds of things. And I disagree that, with the idea that patriotism and pro-EU narratives are necessarily contradictory. I think the best kinds of narratives are ones that instill a sense of pride and maybe even patriotism in Europe itself. I think the points you bring up about democracy are a very good example of that. Europe can claim to be the home of democracy. It can claim to be the home of several different monuments to both culture and politics and innovation. I think the narratives that we would need to focus on would be ones not of oh, this is a French accomplishment or whatever, this is a European accomplishment. Together we are all sharing this European heritage rather than just simply a single national one. And I don't think that one's that different from a narrative that populists employ with just UK. It's just you have to widen the lens. And I think in a world that is becoming more connected and smaller, essentially, where people see one another in the EU and around the world a lot more often, I think that's easier now than it was at any point previous in history.
Jean?
I'd like to go back to the point on democracy, because I think that it's less about PR and narratives and more about genuine debates. We're having some, takes what's in the news, I mean, we're having the taxation of the GAFAs, and that everybody perceives it's a European issue. That's not something that's going to be dealt with at national level so much. And Commissioner Vestager, I think, by using competition policy and actually winning the case, because actually, you know, we just learned that Apple is going to pay to Ireland, has created a European debate. I mean, it has shown something. People care about inequality. People are today, I mean, care a lot about distribution. Europe has been extremely absent from this debate, and now it's sort of coming into it. And the question will be, you know, is it delivering something to the citizens or not? Same you could say about, you know, we're having this debate on glyphosate. That's something people care about, that their environment, that their health. Health matters a lot. They see that, you know, it's a European legislation. They understand why. The question is, you know, whether there is a political debate at European level on that. And I think that's by having genuine political debate that matter for people, it's going to change the conversation.
I think both Henrik and Philip want to come in.
A short remark. I think democracy is important, but democracy requires leadership. You need someone to steer the country or the basis that is voting into the right direction. What happens when you ask an open question to a country and don't know which direction you are actually supporting? Well, we've seen how this ends up with Britain. And so I think democracy is the necessary condition, but not the sufficient condition. On Europe, I would always be hesitant to say, well, if we don't know what to do, let's ask the people. Well, be careful what you wish for and what you ask for. If on the contrary, you have a clear project and you say, now it's ready, I give it to a referendum, and I ask people on that, then I think this can succeed, which is why I'm more skeptical about the democratic conventions Emmanuel Macron has put forward than many other people. I think it can be, if badly managed, it can be a recipe for disaster.
Philip?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think you have to separate out the populists from the people who support them, because a lot of the support for populists comes from people who've got genuine grievances. And it seems to me the populists benefit from three things: insecurity, insecurity, and insecurity. People are insecure about their economic prospects and their families and their children's economic prospects. People are insecure about their cultural identities often, and they're insecure often about their physical well-being. The brilliance of the Brexit campaign, and in many ways it was brilliant in terms of just the marketing in the UK, was that it said all this is globalization, and the EU is the agent of globalization. So people didn't vote to leave the European Union because they were fed up with bureaucrats in Brussels or whatever. They saw the EU as the sort of establishment elite, which was an agent of this insecurity. It seems to me that if you want a sort of popular approach from Europe and pro-European politicians, everything's got to be rooted in persuading people that what Europe is doing is designed to enhance their security in that broadest sense. And I think you can get a populistic type message out of that.
There was a question here, and then I'll come back to the other side. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question was actually, I raised my hand earlier, but it touches exactly on what you just said. Basically, the message of this debate and meeting has been: should we adapt to the game of slogans, of social media, of 150-character tweets? And I was asking, what if we do it the other way around? People who study populism and media and new social media tend to emphasize how social media is a very good medium for populists, because populists present the world in simple terms. They present the world as simple. They say solutions are simple, problems are simple, and solutions are simple. and they throw out simple slogans, simple messages. And that fits very well to 150 characters. If we're going to have an exercise in intellectual sincerity, we know that the world is complex. Problems are very complex, and solutions are also very complex. And if we're going to have intellectually sincere slogans, they're going to be very, very complex slogans. And I was thinking today, in a way, we have an obligation to ourselves, to what we believe in, to not go down to play that game, I think. To not reduce ourselves to simple discourse. It's nice to say, to have a tweet, together we can do it, but this kind of European patriotism, I think, is not going to take us too far. Together we go, individually think, this kind of things, yes, but I think we've heard a lot of those before.
I think Julian has been trying to explain that what he wrote about is actually deeper than, you know. Let's just take the same. It's not about adopting similar messages. It is about marketing a much better message, and it's not about changing policies. It is about trying to explain policies, but in a way that can appeal to people. Julian, I'm going to let you say it again.
So, I mean, I definitely see where you're coming from about the point about we should be true to ourselves and take the high road. I think a lot of people have made that argument to me before about this. Two things. First off, taking the high road is great, but if we lose elections, then we're going to lose eventually the European Union if we lose elections and referenda on staying in the EU. I had a class on crisis diplomacy earlier today. Someone asked, should foreign policy be based off liberal moral values, or should we be more focused on practical things like realpolitik, stuff like that? I think this is a very similar thing where you need a balance of the two. They're not inherently contradictory, but you need a balance. And an intellectual sounding slogan or message or whatever, that's great. It's going to appeal to us, the policy wanks who attended a panel at the Hertie School of Governance here in Berlin. It's not going to appeal to a worker working in a factory somewhere in a southern European country. Just because a slogan is simple and direct and maybe not as detailed as the policy backing behind it does not necessarily mean it's inherently bad or it's reducing the policy behind it. In my opinion, it's having a good, simple message you can give to people. The elevator pitch, essentially, is actually a very important part of democracy because it's helping people who are outside of the intellectual bubble get into the conversation, even if they're not necessarily as informed or have the ability to be as informed due to other time constraints or lack of resources.
Go ahead, yeah.
Hi, I'm also an MPP student here at Hertie School. My question is, Henrik, you just said it's not so much about narratives, Europe is just there. So my question is, shouldn't we then consider this in our narratives? I'm always wondering, shouldn't we refrain, or more importantly, people who actually have a say in Europe, refrain from even voicing the end of the EU, the end of Europe as an option? I mean, no politician in France would talk about, if we don't, then there will be no France tomorrow. No politician in Germany says, if we don't do this, there will be no Germany tomorrow. So I'm wondering, wouldn't it help a lot to just refrain from this narrative of the end of the EU, the end of Europe, and just get to the business on reforming it, but don't talk about how it could end?
Henrik? That's
a very smart question. You should direct it to our Chancellor. Angela Merkel said, if the euro fails, Europe fails, which is exactly the type of narrative you criticize. It's one of those questions where I think I have to think more about. I don't have an answer right now, because on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right. We should no longer adopt the narrative. On the other hand, we see that it's part of the political discussion to end the European integration project, at least ever closer union as it's in the treaties. And so we could also just make the mistake of avoiding a very central part in some of the discussions in Hungary, in Britain, in other countries. What I was trying to say about the narrative is, let's not try to find a rationale for Europe that goes back to history, war, etc. It's just, we live in a multi-level cake situation where Europe is just one normal element in decision-taking. We have the global order, we have the European order, we have nation-state, the subnational level, the local level. And I think this millefeuille of governance is what we need to get across. We sometimes also overburden the European Union by saying, you know, Europe has to do everything. And sometimes Europe itself has made the mistake of saying we need to regulate everything. So we just need to normalize Europe, not overburden it, and not blame it on everything. I know you said this, the scapegoat thing about Europe is very, very bad. This is what I meant by the narrative. In that sense, we agree. We don't have a narrative for the local level, the state level, the nation state sometimes, not the global level. So perhaps let's be more pragmatic in focusing on this.
Julian, you wanted to come back in,
yeah? Yeah, so I like your question a lot too, and I've had similar thoughts. I think the answer is similar to what Henrik described, a middle road, middle being seemingly the answer to all questions. I think you can't avoid the idea of the EU ending because the cat's out of the bag there. I don't think you can put a narrative back in the box and pretend it never happened. But I think, for example, I think Juncker made a mistake when in his white paper we outlined 5 narratives for what the future of Europe could be. One of them was just like, oh, no more Europe, essentially. I don't think that's a good way to legitimize your own position if you just, if you take something which I think most policy experts would consider to be a terrible, terrible idea and put it up there just because people have said it as if it is as legitimate of an option.
You've been waiting patiently, so yes, go ahead. And then...
Hi, I'm Meg. I'm also here at Hertie. And I am often puzzled or surprised when we talk about reforming or innovating the European Union, providing a vision. We look westwards for inspiration, like we look at the United States sometimes. We hardly, or we still, I think, are very cautious to look eastwards, say to Asia or to China, for lessons that we can possibly learn. Because I think what's interesting in the past 4 years, China put out actually a vision and a proposal, the Belt and Road, to basically reform its country, solve internal problems, create really a vision for its citizens going forward, and also how to integrate the wider region. And they put out new institutions, and everybody's right now is talking about kind of China's rise, right? Rather than when you would talk about Europe, you talk about Europe's collapse or end. So I'm wondering, I would ask you, what do you think must Europe learn from China, if there's anything at all?
So I'm by absolutely no means an expert on China. So bear with me if my answer is vague. I think part of the problem is that there are technical and policy things we can certainly learn from China, but what you just described of, oh, China brought out this thing which will, brought out these policy pieces which will serve as a guiding vision for their own population and for the region. China and a lot of other countries in Asia, as well as even Russia, have the advantage of being able to make decisions quickly because they're not democracies. That's not saying democracies are bad things by any means, but they're slow because it's a consensus-building process. In China, you can have the higher leadership of a small group of people agree and bring out this kind of policy, whereas in Europe, you need not only the consent of the people of Germany, but also 27 countries. So,
the short answer is leadership. I was at a conference. I was at a conference on this weekend with a Chinese leader, and that person said something very remarkable to a group of European leaders in the room. The message was, "We can't wait for you to get your act together." The message was, You ask who is in the driving seat. All I can tell you is we're not even on the same bus. We're driving our own vehicle in the direction we consider the right one. I think that's a remarkably blunt message to the European Union and to America. You struggle with populism, with Brexit, with all your messy internal policy things. The world moves on. We're no longer in the 20th century.
There was one question here, and I think we're... Yes.
I'll try to be brief. Hi, my name is Lucas. I'm a second-year MPP student, and my question relates to Brexit. I think an issue which relates a lot to the future of Europe and will be pretty important. I mean, in a way, the EU has quite incentive to make the negotiations as hard as possible to make the exit of the union to appear as less attractive as possible. Do you think there could be? Is there any room, and I'm trying to be desperately optimistic here, is there any room that the Brexit could like serve as a bad example, as kind of and have a deterrent effect, and maybe in that, then in the end make the exit from the union and a kind of a anti-union view less attractive? Again, I'm trying to be desperately optimistic here.
Philip, you want to take that one?
I mean, I think my perception is that most European governments certainly don't want to make it easy for the UK, but I don't think they want to be punitive. I think they take the perfectly reasonable view that if you belong to the club and you obey the rules and you pay your dues, there are certain benefits that accrue to you from that. And if you leave, you lose the benefits. I'm afraid my own government seems to think that we can leave and say, but we quite want to keep that benefit and that benefit and that benefit. And that's not going to happen. I mean, the last 9 months have been a collision between ideology and reality in the UK, and the next 9 months are going to be another collision between the ideology and the reality. I do think such a mess that my own country is now in, that it's possible that we won't leave. And I say that not because I think any of these politicians will have a great change of heart. It's just that it's beginning to look politically impossible to find a majority in the Houses of Parliament for any particular version of Brexit. So we may get to the stage where the government negotiates a particular version of Brexit and it's rejected by Parliament. And then we're in completely new territory. We may end up in a sort of no man's land for a long time.
No, but then you leave automatically.
No, we don't. This is wrong. This is a mistake. This is absolutely a mistake, and you should check with your own government, because your own government's position on this is, were Britain to write a letter, for example, saying, actually, maybe we've changed our minds.
Okay, but that's
different. But Philip, that takes writing a letter. That's the point.
Let me.
Without the letter,
hang on. Sorry, there's a second part to this. There's a second part, because this has been considered, I don't
know how we avoided Brexit for an hour and a half. Yeah.
What happens if there's a situation where it's voted down in the House of Commons and the British Prime Minister writes a letter and saying, can we have a 2-year delay while we have a general election and we try and sort ourselves out? The view that I've got from here, and also from Paris, and also from Brussels, is that most European governments would not say, okay, no, that's it, time's up, you've got to go, we're going to push you out the door. So there is a chance that out of chaos, this is my optimism, but out of crisis and chaos in Britain, we may be so incompetent and stupid that we can't actually leave.
An alternative to leadership.
Well, but one point on this. So both scenarios, not to create a wrong impression, require that the British Prime Minister can write a letter either asking for an extension of the Article 50 period, which requires unanimous agreement by all the other EU countries, and you would get it, not for 2 years, but I think for 5 years, which is the tenure of the European Parliament. Britain would participate in the EU elections and stay for another 5 years. So I'm entirely with you on that. I also agree that this other scenario, the letter you write, where you say, we want to stay, would be accepted. But what I thought you were arguing, and I think this is also a scenario, is if there is no agreement and the British Prime Minister doesn't have the courage to send one of those two letters, then at 1 o'clock in the morning, no, is that right? No, 11 p.m. at night, due to the time difference, but Michel Barnier always insists it's midnight Brussels time, not London time. At midnight Brussels time, the UK will be out.
Yeah, no, that I wasn't.
I think the second part of the question was exactly whether there was fear that there'll be a domino effect, but because in the UK we made such a mess of it that nobody wants to go through this experience. So it's had the opposite effect in a way. We have run out of time, but I'm going to let you ask your question as the final question.
I'm just curious about, so obviously the underlying kind of reason for Brexit was, and we kind of touched on it in the conversation, was kind of income inequality. And so in the UK, for example, there's like, I think 8 million people are in working poverty. And that is kind of probably the underlying cause of this instability and the rise of populism. And I'm just kind of curious as to what the panel thinks, how that is compatible with the kind of underlying economic, I guess, ideology or sentiment of the European Union in general. Because obviously we could not leave the EU, and but still the inequality would still persist within the UK, and there would be this kind of feeling of discontent among lots of people in the UK. And across, and in France and across the rest of the continent. So I'm just kind of curious as to whether those two, where the compatibility is, I guess.
Philip, maybe you can take that up, but just in one second. Okay, go ahead.
We've gone through an extraordinary period where incomes in the UK and across Europe have effectively, for most people, not moved at all for the last 10, 15 years. For a lot of people have fallen. If you imagine the world is going to continue like that, then we're in serious trouble. What Europe has to be about is promising that that's not the world that we're going to continue with, and that inequality as a consequence will begin to decline.
Jean, and I think these are the final statements. So,
yeah, I think this brings us back to Julian's very first point. I mean, the days where we had politics at national level and policy at European level being not subject to politics are probably over. And that's very much the issue of inequality, because people blame for inequality, they blame domestic policies, but they also blame liberalization, they also blame a number of policies that are of the responsibility of the EU. How to deal with it, and and competition and posted labor and all sorts of things of this sort. So I think the question is, can we have a political debate at European level that is not a political debate about yes or no, do we want to be in the EU or do we want to get rid of the EU? But it's a debate about true political issue that on which we can have a common debate and a common conversation. And we haven't yet found the way to do it, because politics tends to become very national each time we're trying to start this discussion. But we've reached a stage at which this does not fit the reality anymore. And I think that's a contradiction we've got to solve.
Henrik?
If I had to put this into a tweet, I would say Europe is neither the cause of nor the remedy to inequality in Britain. We need a Europe that protects, and leaving the EU will certainly increase inequality in Britain, not decrease it.
Thank you. Julian, you get the last word.
Oh boy. I want to thank you guys all for coming and expressing your opinion. I realize that my article, while a lot of people seem to appreciate it, is also quite controversial in terms of people thinking that I'm arguing against political discussion as a whole in favor of tweets, and people thinking that that's not very effective. But I want you guys to think about in the future what kind of leader you guys would like to see as the face of Europe, if there had to be a face of Europe, and what kind of campaign that would entail, whether that's actually a national politician or a EU commissioner or some sort of Brussels bureaucrat. I don't see that as likely, but keep it in mind in the future. I don't think that the bag of social media or the modern 24/7 media environment is going away anytime soon.
I'd like to thank the Hertie School for this event and for taking part in the competition. Jean, of course, and Henrik, and to the rest of our panel, Philip, and huge congratulations again to Julian.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.